Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics and, well, for the first time in ages, am finally able to get a look at American politics again because this is actually pretty huge. I think potentially even more serious than many Americans really appreciate. In fact, I sometimes wonder just how much of the American public really appreciate just how bad a blunder President Trump has committed in the name of the United States in Syria in the last few days. And I'm sure many well-informed ones will, but just what about the American public in general? And this goes beyond the simple abandonment of US allies, which really is serious enough. So before I get onto that, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. But the first thing I think I should probably do is really quickly, for those who may not know, just to explain what was so important about the US military's relationship with the Kurds, who they have now abandoned. So the Kurds were working with the United States to combat the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, and they were providing vital intelligence that US forces were able to use. But President Erdogan of Turkey, who's not on great terms with the Kurds, in fact, they're mortal enemies. Well, that's obvious now, isn't it? He wanted Trump to withdraw American military support for them so that he could launch what can only be described as a genocidal military assault on them. And Trump duly obliged for reasons. And it all came as a complete shock to everyone. US Green Berets were reported to be ashamed of the behaviour of their own country. And make no mistake, this is what it was. Yes, it was an individual maverick man-baby of a president, but this is seen by the world as the actions of America, and it will be when President Trump has gone as well. Even Mitch McConnell, who has sold what's left of his soul in order to facilitate Trump's presidency, said that withdrawing US troops would only benefit Russia, Iran and Syria. And so it has turned out. And there are now multiple levels of failure for Trump here, as well as the wider Republican Party, because although Republicans have come out against the decision, they haven't actually used any of their political influence to stop Trump or this disaster unfolding. They should have stamped on it immediately before it ever happened, when it was simply announced. And as a result of this action, Trump has first threatened Turkey's economy if they assaulted the Kurds, and when they did, as they were always going to do, he has now had to start work on imposing sanctions. And remember, Trump only did this as a favour to Erdogan for whatever reason. So he has created a future mess for the United States in the Middle East to gain favour with Turkey, whom he has now made an opponent because these economic sanctions are not really going to go down well there. And Turkey also has possession of US nuclear weapons. Not that I'm suggesting they have the capacity to fire them, but they have them. And others have pointed out already that maybe the US, before pissing Turkey off, should have taken those nuclear weapons back. But this just explains how Trump has not even gained from his brainless action, much less the US has gained. The US has gained nothing from this. It doesn't explain just what harm, however, is going to befall the United States, and in particular, how this is a massive victory to three nations opposed to America, as I've already mentioned, Russia, Iran and Syria. So the first level of harm is now that the US military cannot be trusted. With overseas operations, and especially in the Middle East, the US cannot operate without support from groups of locals. Allying with the US military can be useful, but it can also be dangerous. It singles you out, makes you a target. No problem, says the US. We've got your back. You'll be protected by the most powerful military in the world. Well, those words are now meaningless. The US are oath breakers who throw their allies under the bus when it suits them. This has a massive impact on the future of operations, and many more Americans will now die when military operations take place if they cannot get local allies and that useful intelligence. The second level of harm is related to that intelligence. So the Kurds were providing the US military with key intelligence on ISIS. Trump excused his behaviour by saying that ISIS were defeated. They are not. Not that it matters, because you still don't abandon allies just because you don't need them anymore, see point 1. But in this case, the US did need them. Needless to say, the US military was saying that that vital intelligence that the Kurds were still providing ended overnight. Of course it did. Not only had the Kurds been betrayed by the US, so why should they carry on helping, but they now had to face a military onslaught by Turkey. Their very survival was at stake. But the US now no longer has that intelligence, so they have given respite to ISIS and indeed any other opponents to the US in the region, which is pretty much everyone now. The third level of harm is that the Kurds have turned to Syria for help. They need allies. Syria was only too pleased. They needed allies to survive, and the only allies they could possibly get against Turkey are Turkey's enemies. That means Syria, Russia, Iran. Syria obviously gains as there is now an absence of the military forces keeping Assad in check. Russia has filled the vacuum, and that's he's an ally. Putin is an ally of Assad, and Russia is extending their influence. They are already allied to Syria, as I said, as is Iran. So Assad will be able to retake a lot of the lost land and exact revenge on those who protested against his corruption and brutality. He will take his revenge in very brutal form, I imagine. Putin is delighted. Russia has now gained the foothold in the Mediterranean that it was unable to during the Soviet era. Iran's gain is by proxy. They invested a lot in supporting Assad when much of Syria began to protest for a better government. Anything that gives Assad victory helps amplify Iran's influence in the region as well. And the fourth level of harm, and this is pretty huge, is that the Kurds were working very closely with the US military. The US trained them and, as I say, worked closely with them. They shared intelligence. And that's a two-way process. This is essentially what I doubt many people realise about the consequences of abandoning the Kurds. It essentially means, so the US shared intelligence with the Kurds as part of those operations. The Kurds in possession of that intelligence are now working with America's enemies. And this is what happens when you let a buffoon run foreign policy in the Middle East. It's harmful enough anywhere, but in the Middle East it's particularly spiky. I'd refer people back to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 80s. The US allied with the Afghans in a proxy war to drive out the Soviets, but they then abandoned the region. Instead of helping rebuild and provide education and training for the people, they just left it. As far as the US were concerned, its objectives were met. The Soviet Union had been driven from the area. They didn't get access to their warm water port, which they now have. And so it was all done with. But in Afghanistan, a power vacuum formed. Of course it did, and nature abhors a vacuum. Eventually, Al-Qaeda filled it, and we all know how that went. This is the thing, when you are providing support in an area, structure, order, you take it away, you create a power vacuum. Let us not forget that ISIS formed in the first place because of the power vacuum left by the withdrawal of US forces from the Iraq region. America has now created another power vacuum. It will be filled by its enemies. The bottom line is that the US has lost a lot of power in the Middle East and their opponents have gained. And I just have to wonder, as bad a situation as this clearly is, how many Americans really appreciate just how bad a mess Trump has made this time, and not even for any gain. And maybe as importantly, will they join the dots when the consequences hit America again? Maybe years in the future, maybe sooner. Or will they act surprised again as if they never saw it coming? The thing is, there is a delicate balance of power in the Middle East. It stinks for everyone who has to live there that the Middle East is basically a global battleground. It's been fought sometimes directly, sometimes by proxy, by players, some local, some not so local. It is a global battleground. Now, if that balance of power were perceived to have shifted decisively one particular way, and at the moment the way it's shifting is towards, say, the enemies of America, then that could trigger all-out war. Now, we are talking about nations who are not terribly keen on tolerating the existence of Israel. So let's say Israel is on the weaker end of that balance of power. Israel has nuclear weapons. Let's say their very existence was threatened. Doesn't bear thinking about, does it? And all because America has elected to executive power a man who puts his own vanity ahead of the interests of his country, and a country who has allowed him to remain there. It's very much like in Britain, we have done exactly the same thing. And the consequences for both our nations could be severe. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.